The young woman was kneeling beside a creek when Preston Ellis first saw her. Her fingers stained green from plant stems. A leather-bound book spread open on the grass beside her, with pressed flowers arranged between its pages like captured sunlight. It was late May in 1879, and Preston had been riding the high country trails above Downeyville, California, for 3 weeks straight, moving cattle from winter pasture to summer grazing lands in the Sierra Nevada foothills. He had not expected to find another soul this far from town, much less a woman who looked like she belonged in a painting rather than the dusty wilderness. Preston pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted quietly, not wanting to startle her. She wore a simple calico dress the color of faded roses, and her auburn hair was pinned up in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to curl against her neck. She was humming something soft and melodic as she carefully positioned a delicate blue flower between 2 sheets of thin paper. "That is a mountain bluebell," Preston said, immediately regretting speaking when she gasped and nearly dropped her book. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide and the color of honey in the afternoon light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Preston felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he had never experienced in his 24 years of life. "I know what it is," she said finally, her voice carrying a hint of defiance mixed with nervousness. "I have been cataloging wildflowers for 2 years now." Preston removed his hat, suddenly aware of the trail dust coating his clothes and the 3 days of stubble on his jaw. "I apologize for startling you, miss. I am Preston Ellis. I work for the Double R Ranch east of here." She studied him for a long moment, then seemed to decide he posed no threat. "Maura Thompson. My father owns the general store in Downeyville. I come up here to collect specimens whenever I can manage it." "That is quite a ride from town," Preston observed, glancing around for her horse. He spotted a gentle-looking mare grazing about 20 feet away, her reins tied loosely to a pine branch. 6 miles, Maura confirmed, turning back to her book. She pressed the flower carefully, then closed the book and set a smooth river stone on top to weight it down. "I have made the journey enough times to know it well." Preston should have tipped his hat and ridden on. He had work waiting, cattle to check, fences to inspect. But he found himself lowering to sit on a nearby boulder instead, his hat dangling from his fingers. "What do you do with them all?" "The flowers." Maura looked surprised by his interest. "I press them to preserve them. Each one is labeled with where I found it, the date, the time of year. I have been creating a complete catalog of every wildflower species in these mountains." "Why?" The question came out more blunt than Preston intended, but Maura did not seem offended. She smiled, a real smile that transformed her whole face from pretty to absolutely beautiful. "Because they are worth remembering. Each spring, these flowers bloom and fade within weeks. Most people never notice them at all. I want to preserve them to prove they existed, to honor their brief and beautiful lives." Preston felt that strange shifting in his chest again, stronger this time. He had spent his whole life in these mountains, had ridden past thousands upon thousands of wildflowers without giving them a second thought. But the way Maura spoke about them, with such tenderness and purpose, made him see them differently. "I reckon that is a fine thing to do," he said quietly. They talked until the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Preston learned that Maura was 21, that her mother had died when she was 16, and that she helped run her father's store while pursuing her flower collecting whenever she could steal away. She learned that Preston had worked as a ranch hand since he was 14, that he had never known his mother and his father had been killed in a mining accident when Preston was 12, and that he had learned everything he knew about ranching from the Double Articus owner, Richard Ramsey. When the light began to fade, Preston insisted on escorting Maura back toward town. She protested at first, saying she had made the ride alone dozens of times, but something in his expression must have convinced her. They rode side by side as the evening birdsong filled the forest, and Preston found himself hoping the trail would somehow stretch longer. "Will you be up this way again?" Maura asked as they reached the point where the trail split, one direction toward town and the other toward the double Arcticus summer range. "I expect so," Preston said, trying to keep his voice casual. "We have got cattle scattered all through this territory. I ride through most days." Maura nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Then perhaps I will see you again." Preston watched her ride away, her straight back and confident seat in the saddle, until she disappeared around a bend in the trail. Then he turned his horse toward the ranch, his mind full of honey-colored eyes and pressed flowers. He found her again 3 days later, kneeling in a meadow carpeted with yellow mule's ears and purple lupines. This time she saw him coming and waved, no fear in the gesture. Preston felt an absurd rush of happiness at the simple greeting. "You have returned," Maura said as he approached. "Are your cattle nearby?" Preston had ridden 2 miles out of his way on the slim chance he might find her. "Close enough," he said, which was not exactly a lie. They fell into an easy pattern after that. Preston would find Maura in different locations throughout the high country, always alone, always with her leather book and her careful hands pressing flowers between pages. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they worked in companionable silence, Maura with her plants and Preston mending tack or checking his maps. He began bringing her things. A particularly beautiful flower he had spotted on his morning rounds, wild strawberries wrapped in his handkerchief, fresh water from a cold spring. Maura, in turn, began to show him her world. She taught him to identify dozens of flower species, to notice the subtle differences between similar plants, to appreciate the intricate perfection of petals and stamens. Preston found himself looking at the landscape with new eyes, seeing details he had ridden past his entire life without truly seeing. One warm afternoon in mid-June, Preston found her by a waterfall, her shoes off and her feet dangling in the pool while she worked on her flower pressing. He sat beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Maura," he said, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from her book, her expression curious. "What is it?" "I have not been finding you by accident. I have been looking for you. Every day I finish my work as fast as I can and then I ride these mountains hoping to find you." He took a breath, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I think about you constantly. When I see something beautiful, I want to show you. When something happens, good or bad, you are the person I want to tell. I know we have not known each other long, but I have never felt like this about anyone." Maura was very still, her flower book forgotten in her lap. "Preston." "I am not asking you for anything," Preston said quickly. "I just needed you to know. I needed to be honest with you." "You said you want to be remembered," Maura said softly. "You said you want to preserve things that are beautiful and brief." "I did say that." Maura set her book carefully aside, then reached out and took Preston's hand. Her fingers were cool from the water, slender and strong. "What if I told you that I have been riding to the same meadows and streams, hoping you would find me? What if I said that I look forward to our meetings more than anything else in my life?" Preston felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. "Do you mean that?" Instead of answering, Maura leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and tentative, her lips tasting like the wild mint she had been chewing. Preston froze for a heartbeat, then kissed her back, his hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that surprised him. When they finally pulled apart, Maura was smiling, her cheeks flushed pink. I think I would very much like to preserve you in my memory, Preston Ellis. Though I find that life itself is better than any pressed flower could ever be. Then we should make a lot of memories worth preserving, Preston said, and kissed her again. The summer passed in a golden haze of stolen moments and growing love. Preston met Maura's father, Marcus Thompson, a gruff but fair man who ran the general store with the help of 2 clerks. Marcus was suspicious at first, protective of his only daughter, but Preston's quiet honesty and obvious devotion to Maura gradually won him over. "You treating her right?" Marcus asked one evening when Preston came to call at the small house behind the store. "I am trying my best, sir," Preston said. "She is all I have got left in this world," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. "Her mother was everything to me. When she died, Maura was the only thing that kept me going. I will not see her hurt. I love her, sir. I would die before I let any harm come to her." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you would. All right then. You have my blessing to court her properly." Preston and Maura's courtship became the talk of Downeyville. The reserved ranch hand and the flower-collecting girl made an unusual pair, but anyone who saw them together could see the depth of feeling between them. Maura would ride out to meet Preston in the high country, and they would spend hours exploring together, Maura adding to her flower collection while Preston pointed out wildlife and told her stories about the land. In the evenings, they would walk through town together, Preston's hand resting lightly on the small of Maura's back, Maura's face glowing with happiness. In late August, Richard Ramsey called Preston into his office at the ranch. Richard was a man in his 60s, weathered and wise, who had built the double R from nothing over 40 years. "I hear you have been courting the Thompson girl," Richard said without preamble. Preston stood straight, meeting his employer's eyes. "Yes, sir, I have. You planning on marrying her?" "I am, sir, if she will have me." Richard nodded slowly. "I have been thinking about the future of this ranch. I have got no children of my own, no family to speak of. You have been with me for 10 years now, Preston. You know this land as well as I do, and you work harder than any 3 men combined." Preston waited, unsure where this was heading. "I want to make you a partner," Richard said. 20% of the ranch, with the understanding that when I die, the rest comes to you. I will draw up the papers legal. In the meantime, I will pay you a partner's share of the profits." Preston felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Sir, I do not know what to say." "Say yes. Then go ask that girl to marry you properly. A man needs to be able to provide for his wife, and now you can." Preston did exactly that. He rode into town the next day with a ring he had bought from the jeweler, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that reminded him of the mountain bluebells Maura loved. He found her in her father's store, helping a customer select fabric, and waited impatiently until they were alone. "Maura, could you come outside for a moment?" She looked at him curiously, noting the unusual nervousness in his voice, but followed him out to the boardwalk. The late summer sun bathed the street in warm light, and Preston was suddenly aware of several townspeople watching them with interest. "Preston, what is going on?" He took both her hands in his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "I love you, Maura Thompson. I love the way you see beauty in small things. I love your kindness and your strength. I love how you make me want to be a better man. I am a ranch hand with little to my name except a good horse and a strong back, but Richard Ramsey just made me his partner. I can provide for you now, give you a real home." Maura's eyes were already filling with tears. "Preston." He dropped to one knee right there on the boardwalk, pulling the ring from his pocket. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making memories with you?" "Yes," Maura said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course I will marry you." Preston slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms and spinning her around while the watching townspeople erupted in cheers and applause. When he set her down, he kissed her right there in front of everyone, not caring who saw, caring only that this wonderful, beautiful woman had agreed to be his wife. They were married in October, when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the first hints of coming winter. The ceremony took place in Downieville's small church, with half the town in attendance. Maura wore a dress of cream-colored silk that her father had ordered special from San Francisco, and she carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers from her collection, each one representing a place where she and Preston had spent time together. Preston wore his best suit, brushed and pressed until it looked almost new, and he could not take his eyes off his bride as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed Maura with all the love and tenderness he possessed, and the congregation cheered. The reception was held at the largest saloon in town, which the owner had cleared out and decorated for the occasion. There was food and music and dancing, and Preston held Maura close through every waltz, marveling that she was his now, his wife, his partner for life. "What are you thinking?" Maura asked as they swayed together, her head resting on his shoulder. "That I am the luckiest man alive," Preston said. "That I found you kneeling by a creek pressing flowers, and you changed everything." Maura lifted her head to look at him, her honey-colored eyes bright with love. "I was just thinking that I preserve flowers to remember beauty, but I will never need to preserve you in a book, Preston. You are here, real and warm and mine. This memory will stay with me always, living and breathing. I want to give you so many memories that you could never fit them all in books," Preston said. "I want to fill our lives so full of beauty and love that we will be talking about it when we are old and gray." "Then we had better start now," Maura said, and kissed him. Richard Ramsay had given them a small house on the Double R property as a wedding gift, a sturdy cabin with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room with a stone fireplace. Maura had spent weeks making it into a home, sewing curtains, arranging furniture, and adding small touches of beauty everywhere. She had also set up a special room for her flower collection, with shelves to hold her growing number of books and a large table for her pressing work. Their first months of marriage were blissfully happy. Preston would rise before dawn to work the ranch, and Maura would pack him a lunch and kiss him goodbye. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk about their days, or Maura would work on her flowers while Preston read aloud from the newspaper. On Sundays, when Preston did not work, they would ride into the high country together, exploring new areas and adding to Maura's collection. Winter came hard that year, with heavy snows that closed the mountain passes and kept everyone close to home. Preston chopped wood and tended the cattle that had been brought down to winter pasture, while Maura organized her flower collection and planned new expeditions for spring. They were snowed in for 2 weeks in January, but neither of them minded. They had each other, a warm fire, and all the time in the world to talk and dream and make love. "I want to publish my collection," Maura said one evening as they lay in bed, Preston's arm around her shoulders and her head on his chest. "I want to create a proper botanical guide to the wildflowers of the Sierra Nevada. Something that people could use to identify and appreciate the flowers for themselves." "That is a wonderful idea," Preston said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "How would you go about it?" "I would need to organize everything properly, write descriptions of each plant, maybe include drawings alongside the pressed specimens." She was quiet for a moment. "It would take years." "Then you should start," Preston said simply. "I believe in you, Maura. I think you could create something truly important." Spring came late in 1880, but when it finally arrived, the mountains exploded with color. Maura and Preston spent every available moment in the high country, and Maura's collection grew rapidly. She had filled 6 books now, each one carefully labeled and organized. She had also begun working on the manuscript for her guide, writing detailed descriptions in her neat, precise handwriting. Preston loved watching her work. There was something almost sacred about the way she handled each flower, the reverence with which she pressed and preserved them. He understood now what had drawn him to her that first day by the creek. Maura saw the world differently than most people. She noticed beauty that others overlooked. She honored the brief and the small, giving them importance and permanence. In May, Maura told Preston she was pregnant. They were sitting by their favorite waterfall, the same place where Preston had first confessed his feelings, when she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is a life growing here," she said softly. "Our child." Preston felt tears spring to his eyes. He pulled Maura into his arms, holding her close, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "A baby. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Maura asked, though she must have been able to feel his tears on her neck. "I am beyond happy. I am everything." Preston pulled back just far enough to kiss her, pouring all his love and joy and gratitude into it. "Thank you, Maura. Thank you for being you, for loving me, for giving me this family." They spent the afternoon making plans, talking about names and preparing the second bedroom as a nursery. Preston was protective before, but now he became almost obsessive about Maura's safety. He insisted on accompanying her on her flower collecting trips, even when it meant leaving ranch work undone. He would not let her ride alone or climb difficult terrain. Maura tolerated his protectiveness with patient amusement. "Preston, I am pregnant, not made of glass. I can still ride a horse." "I know, but I worry. I love you too much to take any chances." "I love you too," Maura said, kissing him. "And I appreciate your concern, but you have to trust me to know my own limits." They compromised. Maura continued her collecting trips, but she stuck to easier terrain and always had Preston nearby. Her pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer, her belly growing round and her face taking on a special glow. She continued working on her botanical guide, determined to finish the manuscript before the baby arrived. In early December, during a cold snap that froze the creek solid, Maura went into labor. Preston rode like fury to fetch the doctor from town, then paced outside the bedroom door while the doctor and the midwife worked. He had never felt so helpless, listening to Maura's cries and unable to do anything to ease her pain. After 8 hours of labor, Maura delivered a healthy baby boy. The doctor brought him out wrapped in a blanket, his tiny face red and scrunched, and placed him carefully in Preston's arms. "You have a son," the doctor said. "A strong, healthy boy. Your wife is tired but doing well. She is asking for you." Preston carried his son into the bedroom, where Maura lay propped up on pillows, her hair damp with sweat but her face radiant. Preston sat carefully on the edge of the bed and placed their son in her arms. "He is perfect," Maura whispered, touching the baby's tiny fingers. "Look what we made, Preston." "What should we name him?" Preston asked, unable to look away from his wife and child. "I was thinking Peter," Maura said. "After my grandfather, Peter Ellis." "Peter," Preston repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Peter Ellis, welcome to the world." Fatherhood transformed Preston in ways he had not expected. He found himself working even harder at the ranch, driven by the need to provide for his growing family. But he also made sure to spend time with Maura and Peter every day, refusing to let work consume him entirely. He would come home in the evenings and hold his son, talking to him about the ranch and the mountains, telling him stories even though Peter was far too young to understand. Maura recovered quickly from the birth, and soon had Peter on a comfortable routine. She continued working on her botanical guide during Peter's naps, and by the time he was 6 months old, she had completed the manuscript. Preston helped her carefully package it and send it to a publisher in San Francisco that specialized in natural history books. They waited anxiously for months, going about their daily lives but always wondering if anything would come of Maura's work. Then, in the fall of 1881, a letter arrived from the publisher. Preston was at the ranch when Maura received it, but she waited until evening to open it, wanting him to be present. They sat together on the sofa, Peter asleep in his cradle nearby, while Maura broke the seal with trembling fingers. She read silently for a moment, her expression unreadable, then looked up at Preston with tears streaming down her face. "They want to publish it," she said, her voice shaking. "They said it is the most comprehensive wildflower guide they have ever seen. They want to print it with illustrations based on my pressed flowers." Preston let out a whoop of joy and pulled Maura into his arms, careful not to wake the baby. "I am so proud of you. I knew you could do it. It will be a real book," Maura said wonderingly. "My name on the cover, my work between the pages. Preston, my flowers will be preserved not just for me, but for everyone." The book was published in the spring of 1882 under the title Wildflowers of the Sierra Nevada, a comprehensive guide by Maura Thompson Ellis. The publisher sent them a dozen copies, and Preston held one reverently, running his fingers over Maura's name on the cover. "This is important work," he said. "This will last long after we are gone, Maura. People will be using this book to learn about flowers for generations." Maura looked at her book, then at Preston, then at their son playing with blocks on the floor. "I wanted to preserve things so they would not be forgotten, but the real things I want to preserve are not in this book. They are here, living and breathing. This family, this love we have built. That is what I want to remember forever." Preston pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Then we will make sure to live every day in a way worth remembering." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Peter grew from a baby into a curious, energetic boy who loved following his father around the ranch. Maura's book sold well, bringing in a steady income and establishing her reputation as a botanist. The publisher asked her to consider writing additional guides, but Maura decided to focus on her family instead, knowing there would be time for more books later. In 1884, Maura gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret. She had Preston's dark hair and Maura's honey-colored eyes, and she was adored by everyone who met her. Peter was an excellent big brother, protective and gentle with his little sister. The Double R prospered under Richard Ramsay and Preston's management. They expanded the herd, improved the breeding stock, and built new barns and corrals. Richard's health began to fail as he approached 70, and he gradually turned more of the ranch operations over to Preston. "You have built a good life here," Richard said one evening as he and Preston sat on the porch watching Maura play with the children. "Better than I could have hoped when I first hired you all those years ago." "I owe it all to you," Preston said. "You gave me a chance when I had nothing." "No, boy, you earned everything you have through hard work and good character. I'm just glad I got to see it." Richard paused, then said quietly, "I have been to the doctor. He says my heart is giving out. I have maybe a year if I am lucky." Preston felt his own heart clench. "Sir, I am so sorry." "Do not be. I have lived a good life and I am leaving this ranch in capable hands. Promise me you will take care of it, Preston. Promise me you will build on what we started." "I promise," Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. Richard Ramsay died in his sleep 8 months later, in the spring of 1885. The whole town turned out for his funeral, and Preston delivered a eulogy that left hardly a dry eye in the church. As Richard had promised, he left the double R entirely to Preston. At 30 years old, Preston found himself the sole owner of one of the most successful ranches in the Sierra Nevada. "Richard would be proud of you," Maura said that night as they lay in bed. "You have honored his legacy in every way." "I hope so," Preston said. "I want to make this ranch something special, Maura. Not just for us, but for Peter and Margaret too. Something they can be proud of and maybe pass on to their own children someday." "They already have something to be proud of," Maura said. "They have parents who love each other and work hard and treat people with kindness. That is worth more than any ranch." Preston kissed her, marveling as he always did at how lucky he was to have found her. "How did I ever deserve you?" "You knelt beside a creek and showed interest in wildflowers," Maura said with a smile. "That was all it took." They had 2 more children over the next several years. Another son, Paul, born in 1887, and finally another daughter, Melissa, in 1890. The house rang with laughter and noise, with the sound of children playing and Maura singing as she worked. Preston hired more ranch hands as the double R continued to grow, but he never forgot where he came from. He paid fair wages, treated his employees with respect, and created a culture of hard work and integrity. Maura continued her botanical work, though at a slower pace. She took the children with her on flower collecting trips, teaching them to identify plants and appreciate the natural world. Peter showed a real aptitude for it, and by the time he was 10, he could identify nearly as many species as his mother. "He has your eye for detail," Preston told Maura one evening as they watched Peter carefully press a particularly beautiful columbine. "And your patience," Maura replied. "He gets that from you." The 1890s brought changes to the high country. More people moved into the area, drawn by mining opportunities and the chance to start fresh in California. Downeyville grew from a small town into a bustling community with schools, churches, and regular train service. Preston served on the town council and helped organize the building of a new school, remembering his own limited education and wanting better for his children. Maura's first book remained popular, and the publisher eventually convinced her to write a second volume focusing on the medicinal uses of wildflowers. She worked on it slowly, fitting the writing around raising 4 active children, and published it in 1895. It was dedicated to Preston, who taught me that the best memories are the ones we live every day. Preston was 40 years old that year, and Maura was 37. Their eldest, Peter, was 15 and already working alongside his father on the ranch. Margaret was 11, creative and spirited, always with a book in her hands. Paul was 8, adventurous and bold, the one most likely to climb too high in trees or ride his horse too fast. And Melissa was 5, the baby of the family, sweet and gentle with a particular fondness for animals. One evening in late spring, Preston and Maura sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks gold and purple. The children were inside doing evening chores, and for a moment, it was just the 2 of them, as it had been so many years ago. "You remember the day we met?" Preston asked, taking Maura's hand. "Every detail," Maura said. "You came riding up while I was pressing mountain bluebells. You looked dusty and tired and a little shy." "I was terrified," Preston admitted. "You were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I had no idea what to say to you. You asked me why I pressed flowers. Do you remember what I said? You said it was to preserve them, to honor their brief and beautiful lives." Preston brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. "I wanted you to preserve me too, Maura. I wanted to matter to you the way those flowers mattered." "You did from that very first day," Maura said softly. "Preston, You have given me a life more beautiful than I ever imagined. This ranch, our children, all the memories we have made together. You are in every page of my life story, and you always will be. I love you, Preston said. More now than even on the day we married, though I would not have believed that possible. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, their hands clasped together. Their lives intertwined so completely that neither could imagine existence any other way. The years continued their steady march forward. Peter grew into a fine young man, eventually marrying a schoolteacher from town and building his own house on Double R land. Margaret went to San Francisco to study art, something that terrified Preston but that Maura insisted they support. Paul followed in his father's footsteps, loving ranch work and the outdoor life. And Melissa showed signs of inheriting her mother's passion for botany, spending hours studying Maura's pressed flower collections. Preston and Maura grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces gaining lines earned through years of laughter and occasional tears. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it deepened, becoming richer and more complex with each passing season. In 1905, Preston was 50 years old and Maura 47. They had been married for 25 years, and the whole town celebrated their anniversary with a party at the church. All 4 of their children were there, along with Peter's wife and their first grandchild, a baby girl named Mary. Preston stood to make a speech, looking out at the gathered crowd of friends and family. 25 years ago, I married the woman I love. I was a ranch hand with big dreams but little to my name. Maura saw something in me anyway, something I was not sure was there. She made me want to be better, to work harder, to build a life worthy of her. He turned to look at Maura, who was holding baby Mary and smiling through happy tears. You taught me to notice beauty in small things, to appreciate the brief and the delicate, to preserve what matters. I hope I have done that, Maura. I hope I have built a life with you that is worth remembering. You have, Maura said, standing to join him. She handed the baby to Margaret and took Preston's hands. You have given me more than I could have ever asked for. Every day with you has been a gift. They kissed while the crowd cheered, and Preston thought about that day so long ago when he had found a young woman pressing wildflowers by a mountain creek. He had wanted her to remember him, to preserve him in her memory the way she preserved those delicate blooms. But what they had built together was so much better than any pressed flower. It was alive and growing, spreading roots and branches through children and grandchildren, through the ranch they had nurtured, through the love they had shared. The second decade of the new century brought more changes. Preston and Maura became active grandparents, doting on Peter's growing family and eventually on Margaret's children, after she returned from San Francisco with a husband, a painter she had met at art school. Paul married a neighboring rancher's daughter, and they built a house on the western edge of the Double R property. Melissa, true to form, went to college to study botany and eventually published her own book on alpine flowers, crediting her mother as her inspiration and teacher. Preston began to slow down physically as he entered his 60s, no longer able to work the long hours he once had. But he still rode the high country trails whenever he could, sometimes with Maura beside him, sometimes alone with his thoughts and memories. The land never changed, not in the ways that mattered. The same peaks rose against the sky. The same creeks tumbled down mountainsides. The same wildflowers bloomed each spring in glorious profusion. One day in 1918, when Preston was 63 and Maura was 60, they rode together to the waterfall where Preston had first told her he loved her. It was a warm June afternoon, and the meadows were thick with flowers. They dismounted and sat by the pool, their bodies not as limber as they once were but their spirits unchanged. I still have that first flower you showed me, Maura said. The mountain bluebell from the day we met. It is in my oldest book, labeled with the date and location. Is it still blue? Preston asked. Faded, but yes. Pressed flowers do not last forever, you know. Eventually, even preserved things deteriorate. Preston was quiet for a moment, watching the water cascade down the rocks. I have been thinking about that, about preservation and memory. You were right that day, Maura. Living memory is better than any pressed flower. Our children remember us. Our grandchildren will remember us. We will live on through them. We will live on through the ranch too, Maura said. Through the land you have cared for and improved. Through the employees you have treated fairly. Through the community you have helped build. And through your books, Preston added. Through the knowledge you have shared and the beauty you have preserved. Maura leaned her head on Preston's shoulder. We have had a good life, haven't we? The best, Preston said. Better than I ever dreamed possible. They sat there until the sun began to set. Two people who had found each other by chance and built a love that had lasted decades. Eventually, they rose and mounted their horses, riding home together as twilight settled over the mountains. The 1920s brought the modern world rushing into the Sierra Nevada. Automobiles replaced horses on many roads. Electricity came to Downeyville. Young people began leaving for cities, drawn by jobs and opportunities that small mountain towns could not offer. But the Double R endured, adapted, and thrived under Peter's increasingly active management, with Preston serving as an advisor and elder statesman. Preston and Maura's 65th birthdays were celebrated with a huge party attended by what felt like half the county. They had 12 grandchildren now, ranging from infants to teenagers, and they delighted in every single one. Preston would sit on the porch with grandchildren on his lap, telling stories about the old days, about meeting their grandmother, about building the ranch, about the wild beauty of the mountains. Maura still worked on her botanical collections, though her hands were not as steady as they once were. She taught her grandchildren about flowers, just as she had taught her own children, passing on her love of the natural world to a new generation. She published one final book in 1925, a memoir called A Life Among Flowers that interwove her botanical work with stories of her family and her life in the mountains. It became her most popular work, touching hearts with its combination of scientific observation and personal warmth. In the spring of 1930, Preston began to feel his age in earnest. He was 75, and the winters had become harder on his joints. He still rode, but only short distances, and he relied more and more on Peter and Paul to handle the ranch operations. Maura, at 72, was likewise slowing down, though her mind remained as sharp as ever. They spent more time together than they had in years, sitting on the porch, walking slowly around their property, visiting with children and grandchildren. They talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in each other's presence after more than 50 years together. One evening in June, they walked to a small meadow near their house where Maura had often collected flowers. The meadow was in full bloom, a riot of color and life. They stood hand in hand, watching the breeze ripple through the flowers like waves on an ocean. "This is what I wanted to preserve," Maura said quietly. "This beauty, this perfection. But you cannot really preserve a living thing, can you? You can press a flower, but you lose the movement, the scent, the way it responds to wind and sun. The best you can do is remember it, hold it in your heart." "Then we have succeeded," Preston said, "because I remember everything, Maura. Every moment we have shared, every laugh, every tear, every ordinary evening and extraordinary day. It is all here." He placed his hand over his heart. "Preserved better than any flower in a book." Maura turned to face him, her eyes still that same honey color though her face was lined with age. "Do you have any regrets?" Preston thought about it, really considered the question. "No," he said finally. "I wish we could have more time, but I do not regret a single day we have had. You gave me a life worth living, Maura. You gave me purpose and love and family. What more could any man ask?" "I feel the same way," Maura said. "I set out to catalog flowers, to preserve beauty, but I found something so much better. I found you." They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, two people who had loved each other well and truly for more than half a century. Preston lived another 4 years, active and engaged until the very end. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1934 at the age of 79, with Maura holding his hand. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, testament to the impact he had made on his community. He was buried in the Downeyville Cemetery, under a headstone that read simply, "Preston Ellis, 1855–1934, beloved husband, father, and friend." Maura lived 5 more years without him, years that were difficult but not without joy. She threw herself into her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, finding comfort in the family she and Preston had built. She continued working on her flower collection until her hands became too unsteady, and she spent her final years organizing her life's work into a comprehensive archive that she donated to a university in San Francisco. On a warm spring day in 1939, Maura asked to be taken to the waterfall where Preston had proposed, the place that had been special to them throughout their marriage. Her grandson Paul drove her as close as he could, then helped her walk the final distance. She sat by the pool for hours, lost in memory, surrounded by blooming wildflowers. When Paul came to check on her, he found her at peace, her eyes closed, a small smile on her face. In her lap was her oldest flower book, open to the page with that first mountain bluebell she had been pressing the day she met Preston. She was buried beside Preston, under a matching headstone. Maura Thompson Ellis, 1858–1939. Beloved wife, mother, and botanist. Their children and grandchildren stood at the graveside, tears streaming down faces young and old. But there was also a sense of rightness, of completion. Preston and Maura had lived long, full lives together. They had built something lasting, not just in property and possessions, but in love and family and the memories they had created. Peter, now 57 and head of the family, spoke at his mother's funeral. "My parents taught us many things," he said. "They taught us to work hard, to be honest, to appreciate beauty in the world around us. But most of all, they taught us how to love. They showed us every day what it means to choose each other, to build a life together, to honor the commitment they made." He held up Maura's oldest flower book, the one that had been in her lap when she died. "My mother pressed flowers to preserve them, to honor their brief beauty. But she knew, I think, that the real beauty in life cannot be pressed between pages. It has to be lived, breathed, experienced. My parents did that. They lived their love every single day, and we were blessed to witness it." The family gathered at the Double R after the funeral, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filling the house that Preston and Maura had made into a home. They told stories, shared memories, laughed and cried together. And through it all, the presence of Preston and Maura seemed to hover, a reminder that love does not end with death, that the things we build together last beyond our mortal years. The Double R continued to prosper through the generations. Peter ran it until he was too old, then passed it to his own son. The ranch evolved with the times, incorporating new methods and technologies while holding true to the principles Preston had instilled. Hard work, fair dealing, and respect for the land. Maura's botanical work lived on as well. Her books remained in print, used by students and enthusiasts for decades. The archive she donated to the university became a valuable research resource, and a wildflower native to the Sierra Nevada was eventually named Maura's bluebell in her honor. But perhaps the most enduring legacy Preston and Maura left was the example of their love. Their children told their grandchildren stories about how Preston and Maura had met, about the pressed flowers and the patient courtship, about the way they had looked at each other even after 50 years of marriage. Those grandchildren told their own children, and the story passed down through generations, becoming a family legend. The waterfall where Preston proposed became a special place for the family. Couples in love would visit it, following in Preston and Maura's footsteps. Some would press flowers there. Some would simply sit and remember the great love story that had started in these mountains so many years ago. On the 100th anniversary of Preston and Maura's marriage, in 2005, the family gathered at the waterfall for a celebration. More than 100 descendants came, ranging from great-great-great-grandchildren to the few remaining grandchildren who had actually known Preston and Maura. They placed flowers on the water and watched them float downstream, a living memorial to two people who had loved each other well. One of the great-great-grandchildren, a young woman named Emily who was studying botany at the same university where Maura's archive was housed, stood to speak. "I never met my great-great-grandparents," she said, "but I feel like I know them. I know them through the stories, through the land they cared for, through the work Maura did that inspired me to follow in her footsteps. But most of all, I know them through the love they shared, because that love created all of this." She gestured to the assembled family. "We are their living legacy. We are proof that what they built together was real and lasting and beautiful." The family raised glasses in a toast to Preston and Maura. And as the sun set over the same mountains that had witnessed their love story, there was a sense of connection across time, of lives lived well and love honored. Back in Downeyville, in the Historical Society's museum, there was a permanent exhibit about the town's notable residents. Preston and Maura had their own section, with photographs from throughout their lives, copies of Maura's books, and even some of her pressed flowers, carefully preserved behind glass. But the centerpiece of the exhibit was a quote from Maura's memoir, written when she was in her 70s, looking back on her life. "I thought I wanted to preserve wildflowers, to capture their brief beauty and make it permanent. But life taught me that true beauty cannot be captured or pressed or made to last forever in its original form. True beauty grows and changes and evolves. It spreads like roots through soil, connecting everything it touches. My greatest work was not my botanical collection, as proud as I am of that. My greatest work was the life I built with Preston, the love we shared, the family we created. That is what endures, not pressed flowers in a book, but living, breathing, growing love that continues long after we are gone." Visitors to the museum would stand and read those words, looking at the faded photographs of a young man and woman in love, of a middle-aged couple surrounded by children, of two elderly people holding hands on a porch. And they would understand in that moment what Maura had meant. Love was not something to be captured and frozen in time. Love was something that lived and grew and spread, creating beauty that lasted far beyond any individual life. The mountains still stood, eternal and unchanging. The creeks still flowed down from the high country. The wildflowers still bloomed each spring in glorious profusion. And somewhere in the midst of all that timeless beauty, the love story of Preston and Maura continued, preserved not in pressed flowers or fading photographs, but in the hearts and lives of everyone they had touched. Their story had started with a simple moment, a cowboy finding a woman pressing wildflowers by a creek. He had wanted to be preserved in her memory too, to matter to her the way those delicate blooms mattered. And in the end, he was preserved far better than any flower could ever be. He was preserved in the life they built together, in the family they raised, in the love they shared every single day. That was the real preservation, the real memorial. Not flowers pressed in books, but love lived fully and passed on through generations. Preston and Maura had understood that in the end, and they had lived accordingly. They had made their lives a work of art, as beautiful and intricate as any wildflower, and far more enduring. The story of Preston and Maura Ellis lived on, a testament to the power of love, the importance of noticing beauty in the world around us, and the truth that the best way to preserve something precious is not to freeze it in time, but to let it grow and change and spread its influence far and wide. They had started with wildflowers and built an empire of love, and that empire would last as long as their descendants remembered to look for beauty in small things and to honor the love that makes life worth living.